there has been a lot of talk about imminent offensives by the Russians, large offensives. And I've heard that talk before. I've heard it many times. And so I take it with a pinch of salt. But it seems like this time the chatter, let's say, is even louder. That there are a lot of people who are generally kind of cautious about these things, are just certain, yeah, there is going to be one. Putin himself made some comment that, we're going to finish them off. And that doesn't quite mean, he didn't specifically say that he was going to launch an offensive, but a lot of people took it that way. I think that maybe that's what we're going to see. I would say there's a better chance this time than I think there ever has been in the past that we will see that offensive. Clearly they have the reserves to do it. They have hundreds of thousands of reserves positioned both in the north and in the south. They could launch these major offensives. And so we may very well see them in about a month. And then, of course, maybe even more importantly, Putin recently said that, okay, again, we have been saying that these 4 oblasts are Russian, and that's not going to change. And we're also demanding that they be recognized as such by Ukraine and by the U.S. And then if this doesn't happen, we're moving on. This was always implied, but I think it was recently that he made that statement. I think when Putin is very, very careful with his words. He sticks to a position. He doesn't budge from it. But then when you see something like in this case, as sort of he clearly has expanded the terms. He hasn't laid it out exactly like what territories may say, but we're moving beyond if these territories are not recognized soon by the other side. That's very meaningful. And again, it does suggest that there's, it doesn't prove, but it does suggest that there is a major offensive or offensives, in the wings.
How do you think America would respond to a major offensive in Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a problem. I've always wondered about that. Again, especially it's just like I've said that it's going to be, it's probably easier to walk away from this agreement than it is to negotiate a settlement. But when you walk away from it and then the Russians start marching on Kiev or they cross the Dnieper, that's going to be, there's going to be a hue and cry. There's going to be tremendous pressure on the administration. And I mean, it seems to me that they've done some things, they've made some statements, they have to some extent changed the narrative, but they really have to do more to prepare the U.S., both the political class, the people, and U.S. allies for what might happen. I don't know if they're going to be able to hold firm. Again, it's just going to, that I don't know what they can do about it. Well, they obviously can do something. They can allocate more funds, promise more weapons to Ukraine. Yeah, Ukraine is still depending on those weapons that Biden allocated to them, before Trump took office. But those weapons will run out within a couple of months. And yeah, if there is a real obvious, if the Russians start marching, much more rapidly than they have been, then we may see Trump reverse himself. I'm afraid that may be the case. I just don't have a whole lot of trust in him. Maybe we'll be surprised because at the same time, on the other side, this is often true with Trump. There are kind of conflicting tendencies within him. I think he first of all, he doesn't give a damn about Ukraine itself, and he really hates Zelensky. And he might just let it happen. But he also is very afraid of appearing weak. I think that's clearly a part of his psychological makeup. And it just may be very hard for him to let this happen on his watch. So, I'm afraid that if the Russians make a huge advance, that we'll see ourselves kind of returning to the old Biden approach. I'm afraid that could happen. That probably will happen.
You think so?
Yeah.
So there's a good chance of that. Instead of extricating ourselves from it, we will continue to be.
Yeah, I would say that. I don't say that with any joy, but I would say that.
Yeah, well, you've been right so far. Your cynicism has been correct. I've been optimistic.
I was somewhat optimistic earlier, but but always tempered by a certain amount of cynicism.
How will Europe respond to a major Russian offensive in Ukraine?
Yeah, well, you see how they're responding right now. That's the big question. I think again, that's there are these threats that Macron and Starmer keep on making, and they seem to be making them, ever more vigorously of sending troops into Ukraine, regardless of what the Russians think. I think that was the most recent statement from Macron. We're going to send there, and we don't care what the Russians think. So and that if they're attacked by the Russians, we'll fire back. Again, I don't know how he would do this. So there's already this intention, and I think it may. Well, let me put it this way. Let's say on the hopeful side, and I'll present the argument that John Mearsheimer made recently. He said that it would actually, maybe this is what we need. We need the Russians to really, to make these large advances, and the desperate situation of Ukraine to become clear to everyone. And then maybe realism will set in, both within Ukraine and within Europe. And then we can start to negotiate. That's possible. That's the hopeful thing. But it's just that I have never seen any kind of, I haven't seen any of this realism so far in either the Ukrainian government or in the European governments, with the well-known exceptions in Europe. So I'm afraid that the opposite could happen. And instead of finally, accepting reality and approaching the negotiating table in a realistic spirit, we may see just the hysteria reach new heights, and we could actually see European troops sent into Ukraine. And yeah. So I think there's scary times ahead. I mean, it's just, I think in the end they can't do anything about it. They just don't have the strength. But that's, but it would be a serious escalation that could, and I think this is a hope probably of both the Europeans and the Ukrainians, that could bring the U.S. in. That would be the hope. Now, so far anyway, Trump has remained firm on that. We're not, no security guarantees. You go there, it's your problem. It's not ours. But again, it's kind of similar as to what I was saying about the Russians marching, towards Kiev or something. It may be that at that point, like let's say if European troops are being obliterated in Western Ukraine or something, that Trump just may again, and then everybody tries to paint him as a traitor and weak or something, that he just might decide that he has to show that he's tough and do something. I think so that there is a real danger there. We'll just say, I think in the end that's not going to happen, but there is that danger. It's always been there and it hasn't gone away.